The King James Version is certainly one of the greatest texts in the English language. It truly is. And it is a Bible through which God has worked in so many amazing ways throughout the centuries. But as for the King James Version, let's understand kind of the background, how it came about. There was a Hampton Court Conference in 1604 between the Puritans and King James. And there, what the Puritans were actually wanting, they were wanting to get any Roman Catholic practices out of the Church of England. That was actually their purpose. Well, many of their demands, King James brushed aside. Some of them he acquiesced to, or at least gave overtures to. But one of the things that happened in the midst of this meeting is they requested a new Bible to be translated. And this was something that King James, he wasn't particularly a fan of their Geneva Bible anyway. And so because of that, partly, he says, yes, let's do this. And so a few years later, in 1604, this translation process begins. They wrap up the process in 1609, and the Bible is published in 1611. Now, it's often said that the King James Version was translated from the traditional Hebrew text, which it was, and also then the New Testament being translated from the Textus Receptus. But sometimes people don't quite understand even what the Textus Receptus was. The fact is, the first Greek New Testament actually to bear the name Textus Receptus was published in 1633, 22 years after the King James Version was published. So this Textus Receptus actually is a reference to several Greek New Testaments that trace back to Erasmus's work in the early 1500s. Now, the actual one that was probably used by the King James translators was a man named Robert Etienne, or the Stephanus. That Greek New Testament was the one that they were actually using. And so they translated from that. So the Textus Receptus isn't even one particular New Testament text. It is rather a grouping or a type of text. And these texts, they don't agree with one another. All these different Greek New Testaments, they all differ from one another. They've been revised and edited in that, all of these Textus Receptus texts. But not only that, they're based on a Greek manuscript family called the Byzantine manuscript family. And just to be in the simplest possible terms, those came from the area that used to be the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And so the problem with those texts are they aren't the oldest ones in the Greek New Testament families. They aren't the oldest ones of all these texts that have come down to us. In fact, the oldest texts come from Egypt, the areas around Egypt, Alexandria, all those areas. So those are the oldest texts of the New Testament. And in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, the oldest reading is to be preferred of a particular text. There's times when you look at an older reading and realize that maybe it had something wrong in the copying, but most of the time, the oldest text is the one you want to go with. But in all of this, what's most important for us to recognize is there are over 5,000 manuscripts and manuscript fragments of the Greek New Testament. And these agree, of all the variances between them, sometimes we can get caught up and afraid, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? There's differences between Greek New Testaments. But more than 99% of those differences between Greek New Testaments, you don't even see in your English translation. They're a word out of order, or a misplaced word, or something like that, a misspelled word. Those are the type of differences there are. And of that less than 1% of differences between all these Greek New Testament fragments, less than 1% of differences, not one difference actually affects anything that we believe about Jesus Christ, about the gospel, about what God has done. None of those doctrines are at stake when we look at the differences between the manuscripts. And so it's important for us to recognize that when I hold in my hand a New Testament, that New Testament faithfully testifies to the message that God inspired all the way back when He inspired His apostles and inspired these eyewitnesses and inspired all these people in the first century to write these texts. My New Testament faithfully testifies to that message.